The idea that religion and rational science are fundamentally opposed to each other is a pretty common one. The myth supported by the Enlightenment that the medieval era was one that was an intellectual wasteland dominated by church dogma and repression of reason is one that simply isn't true. We've already seen this clearly with some of the Islamicate thinkers that we've explored, but in Europe there is perhaps no figure that represents this interconnectedness of faith and reason more than the Catholic theologian and philosopher Thomas Aquinas. He has become one of, if not the most influential thinker in the history of the Catholic Church and one of the most widely read thinkers in the Western canon. His approach to religion and faith was one where it wasn't in opposition to reason and investigation, but that it could rather be strengthened by and benefit from it. And he thereby created a very impressive system that reverberates to this very day. It's been a long time coming, of course, but today we're finally going to talk about Thomas Aquinas. I've been debating with myself for a while whether I should make this video, because Thomas Aquinas is, after all, one of the most famous and most widely studied and known thinkers and philosophers, theologians in history. There is so much content out there about him. There are so many books and studies. It's one of the most widely studied people. There are plenty of good other YouTube videos out there. There are experts who explain his philosophy. So what could I possibly add to that discussion? Also, given the fact that I am not an expert on Catholicism or the scholastic tradition as such, but many of you out there have expressed a wish to hear my particular take on Thomas Aquinas, and of course, I see this as a great opportunity for me to build on my knowledge about him and to get to know him a bit better myself. So here we go. Thomas was originally from southern Italy and the town of Aquino. He came from a well-off family with high standing in the military, but at age 5 he was sent off by his parents to the Benedictine monastery at Monte Cassino, where his uncle was an abbot. Having a career in such a prestigious religious order was desirable to a lot of people, and during his years at the monastery, Thomas would have been introduced to some of the rigorous practices and rules of the Benedictines, who took their monasticism very seriously. But due to political circumstances, he eventually had to leave and instead was enrolled at the University of Naples, where he studied philosophy under influential teachers. We have to remember that when we talk about philosophy at this time, that included subjects that today would fall under natural science and even the liberal arts. So he would have studied things like logic, geometry, astronomy, music, and grammar, among many other things. It also seems that it was here in Naples that Aquinas was introduced to some new and exciting ideas. Indeed, the philosophical works of Aristotle had been appearing in Europe in translation, along with some of the commentators from the Islamicate world, such as Ibn Rushd, Ibn Sina, and the Jewish philosopher Maimonides. These sources and their works were taught to Thomas by a guy called Peter of Ireland, and they would go on to have a massive impact on him, making up the core part of his later philosophy. Aquinas would indeed remain a key representative of Aristotelianism, and much of his work was dedicated to harmonizing it with Christianity, and the unique thought of someone like Ibn Sina shows up frequently as well, as we will see. It was also in Naples at the age of 19 that Aquinas became enamored by another rather new and radical movement, the Mendicant orders and the Dominicans in particular. Now, we've talked about the Mendicant orders in other videos, but in short, this was an entirely new way of living a Christian life that was becoming popular in the late 12th and early 13th centuries, pioneered by figures like Francis of Assisi and Saint Dominic. Rather than the cloistered life and monastic orders like the Benedictines, who could nonetheless become quite wealthy and institutionalized, members of the mendicant orders took on vows of poverty, would often beg for sustenance, and yet lived lives in society, preaching and teaching. And while these orders are today widely accepted and obvious parts of Catholicism, back then they could be quite controversial. Thomas wanted to join the Dominican order, which was quite established in Naples at that time, but his family was completely against this idea and tried their best to keep him from going in that direction. Things got so serious that his mother, Theodora, had him apprehended while he was on his way to Rome and had him imprisoned in Monte San Giovanni Campano. His imprisonment lasted for almost a year, during which time his family would continue to try to convince him to not join the Dominicans, at one point sending a sex worker to try and seduce him back to a worldly life, but it was all in vain, and eventually the family had to give up, and Thomas was allowed to escape and officially join his Dominican brothers in Rome. Thus officially began his career as a friar and religious teacher. He would later go to Paris to study theology at the university there. It was here that he met and became a student of Albert the Great, who would be a huge influence on him and with whom he could hone his skills as a philosopher. This great teacher also seems to have acquainted Thomas with the writings of the fascinating Neoplatonic early Christian writer Pseudo-Dionysius, which would also be a key influence on him. His relationship with Albert as a teacher was so strong that when the latter was sent to Cologne in Germany to teach there in 1248, Thomas accompanied him. That love seems to have been reciprocal in some way, as is indicated by a famous story about the two. Thomas is described as a pretty quiet and shy person, and some reports also say that he was quite large in terms of his physical appearance as well. So some of his fellow students at that time had therefore resorted to calling him a dumb ox, or a slow or mute ox. But when Albert found out about this, he said to them, "You call him the dumb ox, but in his teaching he will one day produce such a bellowing that it'll be heard throughout the world." And rarely has someone been so right as Albert was in that moment. Having studied with Albert in Cologne, Thomas then returned to Paris to officially get his title as master. He did this by, as was basically the standard at that time, composing an extensive commentary on the Sentences by Peter Lombard, maybe the most influential work of Latin Christian theology at that point. He finished the work in 1256, and it already shows Aquinas' unique way of arguing, often diverging from Lombard on significant questions and giving his own opinions. It's also in this period that he composes some of his central commentaries on books of the Bible, as well as holds session of disputed questions, where students would debate certain questions and the master, Thomas in this case, would then give his definitive answers. And these were all written down. In 1259, he was sent back to Italy to serve as a Dominican teacher and lector in a convent in Orvieto, where he stayed until 1265. And it is here that he writes most of one of his most famous and influential works, the Summa Contra Gentiles, which was a kind of apologetic work that defends and argues for Christianity against the ideas of other faiths like Islam and Judaism. Divided into 4 books, this is one of the most widely read in his whole corpus. But in 1265, he was transferred to Rome for a couple of years, and it is here that he began work on what was to become his magnum opus and one of the most famous books in history, the Summa Theologiae. This was meant as a kind of overarching summary of theology and philosophy specifically aimed at beginner students in the topic, and he would continue working on this book until his death. We'll return to this work later on. In 1268, he was sent back to Paris to help settle some disputes that had arisen. On the one hand, there were new tensions between the mendicants and the seculars, which he tried to mend, but there had also arisen a great controversy around the so-called Averroists and their doctrines, which was seen as very dangerous for orthodoxy. Averroism is a movement that, of course, is named after the great Andalusian Muslim judge and philosopher Ibn Rushd, known in the West as Averroes. He was a great commentator on Aristotle, whose works had made it into the Latin West and was becoming very popular. As we'll see, his works were very influential on Thomas as well. But at this time, the movement known as Averroism, or Latin Averroism, had appeared, which was seen as being inspired by him, but which actually doesn't really represent his philosophy at all. Among the things that these Latin Averroists were accused of teaching was the so-called double truth doctrine, the idea that there existed 2 contradictory truths, one reached by rational philosophy and science, and another truth reached by faith and revelation, but that both could be equally true simultaneously. This was actually the opposite of what Ibn Rushd taught, who actually held that there was one truth that could be reached through either reason, philosophy/science, or religion/revelation. They offered different paths and ways of expressing that truth, that it was the same truth. It's unsure whether any of the Latin theologians actually held to the double truth theory either, but this was what they were accused of. Another teaching associated with this group, and one that seems to have been directly tackled and criticized by Thomas, was the idea of the unity of the intellect. This is an idea that was actually held by Ibn Rushd, who proposed that all human beings actually share the same intellect, and that we can reach the culmination of the philosophic life by becoming united to this higher intellect. Aquinas rejected this idea and even wrote a work dedicated to arguing against it called On the Unity of the Intellect Against the Averroists, where he considers it incoherent due to its failure to explain how individual thoughts happen, and that Ibn Rushd had misinterpreted the writings of Aristotle. After this last stay in Paris, Thomas then returned to his home region in 1272 to found a new Dominican studium in Naples at the university there. The place where Aquinas taught in this last phase of his life is where the current church of San Domenico Maggiore stands today, and the cell where he lived still survives. He taught and preached daily in Naples, having become a quite popular authority at this time. And it was here in Naples that he had some of his most profound experiences, some even mystical in nature. He had continued working on his Summa Theologiae over the years, finishing the first 2 parts and working on the final third. But something happened in 1273. On December 6th of that year, while celebrating Mass, he had some kind of mystical experience, one where he entered a state of ecstasy for an extended period of time. After this experience, he shockingly and abruptly stopped all writing, seemingly abandoning his work on the Summa. When his friend and scribe Reginald Piperno desperately begged him to return to work, Thomas famously said, "Reginald, I cannot, because all that I have written seems like straw to me." He had experienced something that day that had shaken his faith in the whole project of writing theology. In that same year, he also had another mystical experience. While he was praying in front of an image of the crucified Christ, the image suddenly spoke to him, saying, "You have written well of me, Thomas. What reward would you have for your labor?" To which Thomas replied, "Nothing but you, my lord." The image that spoke to him is claimed to still survive and can be seen if you visit his cell at the San Domenico church. Had Thomas gone and become a mystic? Well, sadly we can't know for sure because he unfortunately passed away only briefly thereafter. In 1274, the Pope Gregory X summoned Thomas to attend a council in Lyon, France. On the way there, he suddenly fell very ill, possibly after hitting his head on a tree branch. He rested at the Fossanova Abbey in Priverno, close to Rome, and on the 7th of March he passed away, only about 49 years old. But in that relatively short lifetime, he had already left a mark that would reverberate in Catholic theology and in the church generally for the rest of history. His influence, while not maybe that great during his lifetime, would become immeasurable, right? Especially in the Dominican order that he belonged to, his school of thought, which is often known as Thomism, has become basically the standard. For Franciscans, however, his contemporaries like Bonaventure and Duns Scotus has been more influential. Funnily enough, Thomas and Bonaventure actually knew each other and even lived together for a number of years, being friends while, of course, very much disagreeing pretty fundamentally on some theological points. But still, even within the church at large, even though he was a bit controversial at first, Thomas would become one of the main theological authorities. He was canonized as a saint only 50 years after he died in 1323, and in 1567 he was declared a doctor of the church by Pope Pius V. What Thomas Aquinas has come to represent is the quintessential scholastic theologian, the most famous representative of the wider movement in Christianity known as Scholasticism, which was quite new at this time. This movement had developed as a result of the appearance of new translations of ancient texts into Latin, works primarily by Aristotle, but also many of his commentators and successors that had preserved the tradition in the Arabic-speaking world. This led to a kind of revolution of thinking in Latin Christendom, where the relationship between reason and revelation was renegotiated and discussed. And Thomas Aquinas was at the very forefront of this movement. This was defined, of course, by his very impressive and voluminous output of text, some of which we've already mentioned briefly. He wrote a lot of stuff for his relatively short life, from biblical commentary to more outright philosophical treatises. But his great masterpiece and most celebrated work is without a doubt the massive Summa Theologiae, also known as the Summa Theologica, basically the summary of theology. As the title suggests, this is a kind of compendium aimed at an audience of beginner theology students, and basically attempts to cover all aspects of Christian theology. It's divided into three main parts. Number one, the existence of God and his creation of the world and the creation of the human being. Number two, which is dedicated to ethics and morality, things like law and correct action and ritual. And three, focuses on Christ, on Jesus, his life, his death and resurrection, and what all that means for human salvation. Thomas never actually finished the third and last part, however. He was still working on it when he had that mystical experience that made him stop writing, and then, of course, he passed away very shortly thereafter. Instead, others attempted to finish this third part later on by compiling parts of his earlier writings on the topic to make up for the rest of it. Regardless, the Summa is a true masterpiece, one that is breathtaking in its wide scope and its sources. He, of course, takes a lot from Scripture, but also quotes St. Paul, Aristotle, called the Philosopher, Averroes or Ibn Rushd, just called the Commentator, Peter Lombard, called the Master. There is Dionysius, there is Ibn Sina or Avicenna, Al-Ghazali, Maimonides, just to mention a few. It has deservedly become one of the great classics of Christian theology and scholasticism in particular, and is a big part of what has made Thomas such an important figure in that tradition. In the book, he presents his ideas regarding the fundamental compatibility of faith and reason, and how both can lead us to an understanding of truth. To understand where he's coming from, we can go back to that controversy that he engaged with when he was in Paris, namely Latin Averroism and their idea of the double truth. Now, this idea that there is one truth for philosophy or reason and science and one truth for religion, that they are sort of separate truths, but they can both be true at the same time. This is actually something that we find today with a lot of people who seem to have a similar idea that there's this fundamental dichotomy between reason and faith. That faith, per definition, is sort of not irrational necessarily, but is sort of irrational. Someone can say, well, I believe, so they can say, I follow and believe in the findings of science, but I also choose to have faith in God. As if that's something that's necessarily separate from that they're two completely different categories. This idea was something that Thomas completely disagreed with, and his whole project is kind of a way of negating or arguing against that kind of dichotomy. To Thomas, there is just one truth, and that truth is God. To him, just like for someone like Pseudo Dionysius, God is truth itself. It's the truth, the maximum truth of which all other truths in the world are simply participating in some way. Hence, there can be no difference between the truth of revelation or religion, faith, and the truth of science and reason. They have to be one and the same truth. Reason and faith are both important to Aquinas for our quest to understand the world and God. Reason is a God-given gift to us that we are to use to come to our full potential, and it is something that everyone has access to. Of course, this was a pressing question to some. How can we take ancient Greek philosophers like Aristotle as authorities when they weren't Christian and never even heard of Jesus, for example? Or indeed the Muslim and Jewish philosophers that were so widely read? According to a Christian worldview, they were heretics, so why should they be studied at all? Well, to Thomas, everyone has been given the gift of reason, and thus the ability to study and understand the truths of the world, specifically what he calls the natural law that can be discerned from a proper investigation into the world as such. Even moral principles can be gleaned from this study, and thus something like the Golden Rule, which is certainly a true ethical proposition to Christians since it was so clearly formulated by Jesus, is also something that other peoples have come to on their own accord, without reading the Gospels. It's simply an inherent part of the natural law of the universe, and thus basic morality can be reached through reason alone. This was an especially pressing issue when it came precisely to ethics and virtue, and this was a point on which he differed from most of his contemporaries. Was Socrates virtuous, for example, or Aristotle, despite the fact that they weren't Christian? Most theologians during Aquinas' day followed the rather harsh teachings of Augustine, who held that while someone like Socrates could appear virtuous, he wasn't truly virtuous because such a quality can only come about through an illumination from God. Any knowledge of truth, according to this doctrine, required not just empirical investigation, but essentially this illumination from God, and such illumination was only given to those who followed his way, that is, Christians. This was famously one of the main differences between Thomas and someone like Bonaventure, and thus also a later common distinction between Dominican and Franciscan theologies. Thomas, as we've seen, clearly disagreed with this. His approach was much more empirical, you could say. Using the divine gift of reason, we can investigate the natural laws of the world and independently arrive at the truth, even without such illumination from above. This allows even non-Christians to have access to such truths and thus to be able to legitimately embody virtue, for instance. But there are other truths in the face of which our human reason is much more limited, particularly what Aquinas deems supernatural law. For example, while reason can certainly help us understand the world and its divine order, derive morality and certain truths from it, when it comes to actually knowing God as such, this is beyond the scope and limits of reason. And it is in these kinds of circumstances that faith and revelation comes in. These supernatural laws that are inaccessible to reason, we can learn from God's revelation to us in Scripture and by other means. The two should thus never be opposed to or in conflict with each other. Reason is the God-given way that we can discover truths about the world, and even certain truths about the existence of God, for example, but it should also be checked by and informed by faith and revelation. The two are complementary, in other words. True faith is one that is informed and strengthened by reasoned investigation, and true reason is one that recognizes its limits in grasping higher realities. Ideally, both reason and faith should work together to take us to a full understanding of God and the world, the ultimate truth that is simply a quality of God himself. This approach he of course shared with many of his predecessors like the Jewish Maimonides or the Muslim Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina, who approached the question of reason and faith in similar ways, but in the context of their own religions. And in this way, the world of knowledge was opened up to them. They could study Aristotle, who was seen as the philosopher, and derive knowledge from him despite the fact that he was pagan, because truth and knowledge was universal and accessible to anyone, and anyone that had reached truth could be learned from, even if they weren't Christian. This may seem obvious today, but certainly wasn't as obvious back then, and this approach of people like Aquinas would have a lasting impact on how we think about the relationship of reason and faith, science and religion to this very day. But with all this talk about understanding God, what is God actually? How did Aquinas understand God, and what did his philosophy and theology actually look like, more specifically? Thomas's theology is one that is of course deeply affected by his general approach to knowledge and revelation. The influences from earlier thinkers are obvious, as we'll see, but the starting and end point when it comes to theology is always revelation, and as it is recorded in the Bible. We saw before that he wrote several commentaries on specific books in the Bible, and naturally his texts are littered with quotes and references to it. We also find very clear influence from some of the earliest church fathers and theologians. The most quoted figure in the whole Summa Theologiae is St. Augustine, that most foundational figure for Western Christianity. But there's also a lot of Pseudo-Dionysius, the epiphatic and Neoplatonizing Christian thinker from late antiquity. He probably studied Dionysius' writings with Albert the Great, as we saw, and while Aquinas is mainly an Aristotelian, there's also quite a lot of Neoplatonism in his thought. So, God, according to Aquinas, quite a big subject. But famously, at the core of his theology is the assertion that God is, in Latin, ipsum esse subsistens, being in and of itself. If you watched this channel before, this will sound familiar to you. It's basically saying that God is being as such, existence itself. In other words, God isn't a being or a thing that exists or is part of the wider category of existence or being. Rather, God is the very activity of being itself. And he finds justification for this in the famous biblical verse from Acts 17, quote, "For in him we live and move and have our being." But this also comes from an interesting philosophical move, where Aquinas makes a distinction between essence and being, essence and existence. Everything that exists consists of these two ontological principles, you could say. Essence, or what it is, and existence/being, or that it is. I usually explain it like this. When we think of an object like a horse, we can ask two questions. What is it, and is it? The answer to the first question, what is it, is a question of essence. It explains what the thing talked about is, what its whatness is, to use the Arabic phrase. The second question, is it, is one of existence, where the answer is either yes or no, depending on if it exists or not. So something can have an essence. You can think of the concept of horseness without that horse existing in actual reality. So they are at least conceptually separate categories. Everything that exists has being or participates in being. It lives and moves in it. As we saw, that being, in an indistinct way, is God. But all our essences differ. Each individual thing has a different essence that distinguishes it from other things within the field of being. But God is unique in that sense, because to Thomas, God's essence is identical to his existence. That which he is fully the same as the very act of being itself. In other words, God is being in and of itself, ipsum esse subsistens. Now again, if you've been watching this channel for a while, you'll be jumping in your chair right now because this is one of the places where Aquinas' influences are very clearly showing. Indeed, this whole formulation of the distinction between essence and existence and the identity of essence and existence is God is found almost verbatim in the Muslim Persian philosopher Ibn Sina or Avicenna. Now we know that Thomas read and admired Ibn Sina, and we can thus be pretty sure that this argument is heavily influenced by his peer from the East. It's quite an ingenious move, and it led to many fascinating philosophical and theological developments in Western Christianity, just as it did in the Islamic world. So that's base camp when it comes to God. He is being as such, indistinct and thus different from all existing things, while being the very reality in which all those things live, move, and have their being. But God in the Bible is also described as having a bunch of attributes and qualities, right? God is good, God is wise, and God is one, and he's three. So how does Aquinas approach this? In some ways, we can find similarities here to earlier figures like Pseudo-Dionysius, whose theology we have covered in earlier episodes. In short, God as being is a simple reality which contains all perfections as part of its unified essence. One of the attributes that are most important to Aquinas is God's simplicity. What this means is that God is not made up of any parts, but is an utterly simple essence. He's infinite, not in the sense of just extending infinitely in space, but in the sense of transcending and standing outside of space itself, thus not being confined to any single place. And it's for this reason that God can also simultaneously be present in all places. Similarly, God is eternal, but not in the sense of having existed for an eternal amount of time, but in the sense, again, of transcending and standing outside time and space itself. He's not confined to any single point in time and can thus be present and act in every instant and at any point in time as we experience it. But God is also good. He has will and knowledge and other such attributes. And the way Thomas understands this is that God is the reality in which all these attributes that we experience primarily in other human beings have their perfection and true reality. To speak of goodness specifically, God is goodness itself, just like he is being itself, and his goodness is identical to his being. Any other person or creature that is good is only good by participating in divine goodness. Thomas says, God is called good essentially because he is goodness itself, but creatures are called good by participation because they have goodness. A person is never actually good as such, but can participate in goodness, that goodness being identical to God. And the same goes for all other attributes, like knowing and willing. God is the very perfection of knowledge itself, the fullness of will, our will and our knowledge only being pale imitations of that divine quality. But remember that God is also simple, so these qualities are not parts of God, but are identical to the esse or being that he is. Thomas himself says, although God is esse only and not something composite, as material creatures are, nonetheless God has all the perfections which are in the genera of created things. And this is because all these perfections come together in him in accordance with his simple esse. By way of analogy, if someone could bring about the functioning of all qualities by means of one quality, he would have in effect all the qualities in that one quality. In just this way, God has all the perfections in his esse. Esse is being in Latin. This is key to understanding Thomas's theology. But there are other aspects to it as well that don't really fall under the realm of reason as these aspects do, at least to some degree. There are other aspects of God, such as the Trinity or the incarnation of Christ, that Thomas considers to be under the realm of supernatural law or knowledge, that kind of knowledge that we must take on authority of revelation and not based on reason. Of course, while God is simple and one, he is also three. He is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And the incarnation of the Son in the historical Jesus Christ is naturally central to Thomas's whole worldview. It is through the act of God becoming human and suffering on the cross that he has opened up the way of salvation for humanity, and a strong faith in this reality is key for our path there. This is where he enters more firmly into the realm of theology as more clearly delineated from philosophy, even though the two terms are often quite hard to distinguish clearly, especially in a thinker like him. So there are many layers to Aquinas' philosophy/theology when it comes to how to understand God and the very possibility of such understanding. While he definitely held to a kind of epiphanicism when it comes to certain aspects of divinity, he clearly also believed that reason was a tool through which we could actually come to know something about God and his works. At the very least, if reason can't tell us what God is in his true nature, it can at least tell us that he is. In this vein, he also famously presented some quote-unquote proofs or arguments for the existence of God that have become quite well known. This is a whole collection of different arguments, actually, as presented in the beginning of his Summa Theologiae, and which are commonly known as the 5 ways. These are, as the name suggests, 5 arguments for God's existence, all slightly different, but with a similar logical approach. I'm going to be taking all these summaries of the arguments directly from Timothy Paul as he presents them in his Orthodox Handbook of Aquinas. Now, the first way, or argument, is essentially one of motion, and is clearly inspired by Aristotle's unmoved mover. These are the prepositions. Number 1, there exist some things that are moved. Number 2, for anything that is moved, it is moved by something not identical with it. Number 3, a series of movers does not regress infinitely. 4, therefore, there must be a first unmoved mover. Conclusion, the first unmoved mover all people understand to be God. Now, important to note here is that Aquinas isn't talking about motion in the sense of an object moving from one place to another within space, but rather motion in the broader and even metaphysical sense. This can include physical motion too, of course, but it's more broader than that. Anything that happens is motion, fire heating up, life appearing, etc. So that's the first argument. Both the second and third ways or arguments appear to be adaptations of different aspects of Avicenna's argument for the existence of God, which is an argument from contingency. Now, you can check my episode on Avicenna to hear the argument in full, but Aquinas' second way essentially talks about causation. But again, just like for Avicenna, this isn't just causation in the temporal sense, that I exist because my parents created me, or this table exists because someone made it. That's part of causation too, but the term is understood more broadly here in terms of any ontological causation. This table wasn't just caused by the person building it, but is being caused right now by a multitude of different factors that make it what it is. The material, the environment, gravity, and so on. So anyway, Aquinas' second argument goes like this. 1. There is an ordered series of efficient causes among sensible things. 2. It is impossible that a thing be the efficient cause of itself. 3. It is not possible for an ordered series of efficient causes to continue infinitely, for therefore there is a first efficient cause. Lastly, the first efficient cause all people call God. The third way sounds even more similar to Ibn Sina's arguments in the sense that it argues based on possibility and necessity. Ibn Sina famously concluded that God is the so-called wajib al-wujud, necessary existent in itself, that which cannot not be. Now Aquinas' argument goes like this. 1. Some things are such that they are able to be or not to be. 2. It is not possible that everything be such that it is able to be or not to be. 3. Therefore, there must exist something that is necessary. 4. For anything that is necessary, it either has its necessity from something else or it does not. 5. It's impossible for the objects that have their necessity from something else to proceed infinitely. 6. Therefore, one must posit something that has its necessity from itself, which is the cause of the necessity of other things. 7. This everyone calls God. This is one of the more famous and indeed perhaps better arguments in the bunch, and we can see that he also adopts Ibn Sina's attempted solution to one of the more common counter-arguments to this argument, namely, if God is the necessary being, then his creating the world must be necessary as well, since the necessary being must be necessary in its fullness, including its creative activity. Therefore, the world itself must be necessary, and there no longer is anything that is contingent and not necessary. Both Ibn Sina and Aquinas here thus add the distinction that God is the necessary existent in itself, whereas other things are necessary through another. Moving on to the fourth way, it's based on gradation. 1. There are things that are more or less good, more or less true, more or less noble, and so on. 2. But things are called more or less F insofar as they are closer or further from that which is maximally F. 3. Thus, there is something maximally good, maximally true, and maximally noble. 4. That which is maximally true is maximally being, or most fully being. 5. Therefore, there is something which is maximally being, or most fully being. 6. Anything that is maximally F is the cause of all things that are F. 7. Thus, there is something that is the cause of all beings, their goodness, and each and every of their perfection. 8. This we call God. God is the fullness of being and the archetype of all attributes, like goodness and truth. Thus, he is that which is per definition the fullness of those qualities, and by extension, the fullness of being in which all those qualities are. The fifth and final way is from the governance of things. It goes like this. 1. There are some things that lack cognition yet act for ends. 2. Anything that lacks cognition does not act for an end unless it is directed by something that is cognizant and intelligent. 3. Thus there is something intelligent by which all natural things are ordered to their ends for this thing we call God. So those were the famous 5 ways or arguments for the existence of God. Whether you are convinced of them is up to you to decide. You can let me know in the comments if you are or not. Certainly I think some of them are better than others. And regardless, they have been very influential and still are very famous as far as these kinds of arguments go. But Thomas, of course, didn't just talk about God. Indeed, his second book of the Summa is dedicated to the human being. And as we turn to psychology, or the general reality of the human being, we find some of the teachings where he was most out of bounds with his contemporaries. We've already covered the fact that epistemologically, Aquinas is more of an Aristotelian than a Platonist, holding that we get knowledge of things and universals through empirical experience of sense objects that can then be abstracted, rather than through a top-down illumination. And it is in the doctrine of the soul that it was really unique at that time. There were some significant discussions regarding the soul and its relationship with the body. Was the soul, such as the Platonists held, something completely separated from the body, existing before and after it? The way Aquinas defines the soul is that it is the substantial form of the body. This is also deeply Aristotelian and makes the soul and body a lot more interconnected than the Platonic conception. Rather than the soul being some external force residing temporarily in the body, like a pilot piloting a ship, the soul is the essence that gives life and activity to the body, and which makes it what it is, responsible for all its activities and even lower ones, like appetite, for example. Related to this, the commonly held view by many medieval thinkers was that a single substance, like a person, had multiple forms, each responsible for different things. One form for the body, perhaps, one for the intellect, one for other individual organs, etc. And this was the view held by many significant contemporaries like Duns Scotus. Aquinas very much disagrees here, though, and claims that there is only one substantial form of the body, and that one form is the rational soul. Rather than multiple forms, there is one form that has multiple powers, without making that soul into multiple things in itself. The powers of the soul are not identical to it, but are potentialities that don't affect the oneness of the actuality of the soul itself. Aquinas says, "One thing, simpliciter, is produced out of many actually existing things only if there is something uniting and in some way tying them to each other. In this way, then, if Socrates were an animal and were rational in virtue of different forms, then these two, in order to be united simpliciter, would need something to make them one. Therefore, since nothing is available to do this, the result will be that a human being is one thing only, as an aggregate, like a heap." This might sound very complicated and difficult to the uninitiated, but it was a quite hot topic, and when Thomas was condemned after his death, it was often for these kinds of teachings in particular. For example, his idea that the soul is the substantial form of the body makes the two very strongly connected, rather than the soul being separate. And this could very easily lead to an interpretation where the soul isn't really immortal, but dies with the body, since the two are essentially connected. This wasn't quite what he believed, however. He did believe that a soul without a body lost some of its key functions, thus that a body-less soul is incomplete in a sense. And this, of course, fit well with the common Christian doctrine of the future bodily resurrection of the dead, when the two will be united again. So while the soul can exist after the death of the body, primarily through its intellectual activities, its end goal is to be reunited with the body at the resurrection. While Aquinas held to these more empirical and Aristotelian principles, where we use our reason to infer things from the sense impressions we get from the world, that doesn't mean that he completely rejects the existence of illumination from above too, or that God can impart truth and knowledge on us through more, let's call it supernatural means. And this also leads me to that often perennial question on this channel, whether Aquinas was in fact a mystic. Or rather, did he become a mystic maybe at some point in his life? We saw, for example, with someone like Ibn Sina, or Avicenna again, in the Islamic East, that while he was also very much an Aristotelian, very much basing his writings and ideas on rational demonstration and investigation, toward the end of his life, he started talking about certain of these topics in a much more mystical or Sufi way. Right, there is the last section of his Isharat wa Tanbihat, for example, that is quite mystical in nature. So can something similar be said about Aquinas? On the face of it, it doesn't seem to be that way, because Aquinas is so dedicated to philosophy in terms of reason, demonstration, and argument, and like demonstration. That's really what he's known for, and there's no point in his career where he stops doing that. Even in his last writings, that's still his style and his way of going about things. So there seems to be very little evidence for him being a mystic, except, of course, for those experiences that he had at the very last phase of his life. The only thing that we have to go on are those accounts of the last months of his life in Naples, where he certainly seems to have had experiences of a mystical nature. There is the account when the image of Christ spoke with him, and some onlookers even claim that he levitated. But I think the second account is even more interesting, when he entered some kind of ecstatic state during Mass and immediately afterward gave up writing, saying that all that he had written was now like straw to him. This seems to fit a pretty classical mystical character, namely 1. The apophatic nature of the divine and the impossibility of saying anything about it, a notion that he certainly wasn't unfamiliar with in general, and 2. The sense of an overwhelming presence of God that rendered all other things redundant. As I said before, had not Aquinas passed away only a few brief months later, we might have had a lot more to say about this possible mysticism of his later career, but sadly, this is all that we have to go on. Regardless, Aquinas left an enormous mark on the history of philosophy and theology. Today, he is seen as maybe the quintessential medieval philosopher, especially in Europe, and the most famous Christian theologian from the Western Church. But this status wasn't at all obvious at first. While his canonization came quite early, as we saw before, Thomas was a pretty controversial figure. Some of his teachings, especially those on the nature of the human soul and epistemology, were clearly not in the majority, and there were many who condemned his teachings. For the first couple of decades and centuries, his status as a central, influential Catholic theologian wasn't at all certain. And some even question this status today, arguing that while he is definitely most famous, other contemporaries of his were equally, if not more, influential in church doctrine. But over the centuries, especially with the Renaissance and modern periods, Thomas's name grew increasingly in renown. He became very important and central to the Jesuits, who would also have a major impact on Catholicism, and his philosophy became a good and useful tool for the Counter-Reformation to defend Catholicism against the doctrines of the burgeoning Protestant churches and their teachings. Today, he is studied not just among Dominicans, not just among Catholics or Christians, but basically by everyone. If you enroll in a philosophy program at a university, Aquinas will be on your reading list. Sadly, he's often the only medieval figure on the list, but this really shows you his importance. In other words, Thomas Aquinas is a truly giant figure, not just for the Catholic Church and for Scholasticism, but for the entire intellectual history of mankind. His approach to religion and reason is inspirational to many people today who seek ways of adhering to contemporary scientific views while simultaneously maintaining their faith. And Thomas offers a way forward where faith and reason shouldn't be, and indeed can't be, in opposition to each other. And many of his philosophical arguments about God, revelation, and psychology are still impressive and worth taking into consideration to this very day. Thank God for Thomas Aquinas. And thank you so much for watching and listening to this video. I hope you enjoyed and learned something new, or at least enjoyed my particular take on this very studied and covered topic. I really enjoyed making this episode, getting to learn more about Aquinas. So again, thank you so much for watching. I would like to, as always, give a special thank you to my Patreon community who support the channel monetarily. This is really the best way to support me over here and my work. So I would highly appreciate if anyone else wanted to become patrons too. So I'll leave links to all that in the description. It's really helpful. So thank you all so much for that support. You can also leave a one-time donation through PayPal or on Patreon too. There is that option now. If you're interested in my work, for example, my music, I am releasing a new single with my project Zini on the 5th of September. It's more of a sort of rock tune, but with some Middle Eastern influences, as is often the case with my music. It's called Tasting, and you can find links to pre-saves and stuff in the same link tree in the description. Also check out my other channel, Philip Holm, where I post all that music and also news and content about music generally, if you're interested in that. You can also follow me on all my socials to keep up with my work in general. And that's it. So again, thank you so much, and I'll see you next time.